So anyway, welcome. Uh, the big fat thank you and heartfelt thank you to my friend Natasha Pearl to kindly introduce to our friends here at Rafana today. Natasha is a stalwart and well-respected person in the family office community. Um, I don't mind telling you that Natasha Pearl and Ashton Pearl focus on family offices for everything other than money. And she's done it for quite a long period of time. And I also will embarrass her by sharing with you that we sat together in the Harvard Club, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago at the onset of her commencing her business. And she's been wildly successful and a good, thoughtful friend for quite a long time. And I appreciate her connecting us with Rafana, and you'll see why today. So thank you, Natasha. Um, Again, a little bit of Zoom housekeeping for you. For the record, we're recording this, so if you miss anything or somebody you want to share it with or others that you think you will benefit, we'll be posting it on the Family Office Insights YouTube channel, so you can review it at your leisure and fast forward through it to the points points in the recording that are important to you. And again, we encourage you to share it with others that might benefit if for whatever reason they couldn't make it today or they're just not on the invite list. And so we thank you in advance for doing that. For the record, we also will encourage you to ask questions in the chat box, the Q&A along the way. Please don't hesitate to ask them. We'll get to as many as we can. There's a lot of people on the call today, but we'll do our very best. So don't be bashful and just go ahead and ask away anything. And another thank you to the community, the Family Office Insights community, which is now over 20 years old and in earnest over the last 13 years. And we really appreciate the community that everybody has contributed to, and especially during the times of COVID, where we've switched from in-person meetings to webinars, and everybody's been thankfully quite engaged. And again, a big thank you to everybody. So let's just say that what struck me about this, what you're about to see here, is that we're having a hard enough time getting vaccines to the developing world. And what you're going to hear about is how to get it to the non-developed world, which is obviously a humanity issue. And so Rafana is attempting to do that. They're pretty far along. And so you'll hear exactly what's going to happen in the plan and where they are. And just to be super clear, this is a webinar to understand what Rafana is doing, and with the intention of seeking people who want to vote with their checkbook, which in English means investing in the company. If that's not your interest, please don't promote yourself in the chat box. Just listen in, and if it's interesting to you, and if there's anybody in your orbit or in your community that you care to share it with, we welcome that. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Brian, who I've got to know a little bit, and it's all yours. The only thing I would ask everybody to do that's a panelist, sorry, is to go on mute until you're speaking, just because it's just background noise, independent of how quiet it might be in your room. So Brian, take it away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arthur, and we're very, very grateful to you and your team for giving us this opportunity. It's very exciting to be able to present to an audience such as you represent in your network with the Family Office Insights. And what we want to talk about today, as Arthur said, is what we are doing at Rafana to create a safe, effective, and low-cost COVID-19 vaccine. So we're going to talk a bit about the challenge the world is facing. We'll cover the different vaccine classes and what's suitable for distribution in the United States versus what might work in parts of Africa, South America, Asia, etc. We'll introduce our team, and then finally we'll get around to the sort of economics of the whole thing, how we're going to do a good thing, but make it a viable business at the same time. So that's the big overview. I'd like to talk a little bit about the team next, and introduce the photos of the people you're going to meet. Now, I'm Brian McCorba. I'm the Chief Executive and Co-founder. I don't have a medical or scientific background, but I do have a background over many years of setting up various high-tech businesses and e-commerce, cybersecurity, electronic payment systems, automated trading systems in the financial markets, etc. So my knowledge is how to get a tech business together. Philip brings in the essential ingredient for this project, the medical and scientific knowledge. I'll ask Philip to talk more about himself shortly, but he's basically spent about 15 years at Harvard Medical School, studying and on faculty, researching at Dana-Farber. He was also a research assistant to a Nobel Prize winner in medicine, and then he worked in industry and set up his own company, biotech company on NASDAQ. So Philip will give you a bit more on that, but Philip clearly provides the knowledge I lack, and together as a team, we're building the business. I've included next the photograph of Professor Stefan Paul. Stefan's unable to join today's call, but I want to tell you about him. He is our chief vaccine consultant. He's one of the most prominent vaccinologists in Europe. He is a professor of vaccinology at the Université Jean Monnet in Lyon, and he's also the head of the immunology department at a large hospital. So he's both an academic and very hands-on. He's developed the only postgrad course in vaccines worldwide, which is used by everybody to train their vaccine staff. So he's connected all over the world. He's an advisor on numerous European community committees. And currently with COVID-19, he is specifically one of 2 vaccine advisors to the French government on the choice of vaccines and the vaccine strategy for France. A very prominent, very helpful individual as a core member of our team. Finally, you'll see Mark Terchan. Mark is our lead investor. And we would not be here today except for Mark, where Philip and I started the company. We did the initial research. We worked with the team, actually put together a team of 40 scientists in 12 countries. We worked initially with something a little bit like an open source software project, bringing in experts in other vaccines like HPV and malaria. And we did all that groundwork, and Stefan Paul obviously was part of that with us. We got to a point where we knew we could design a vaccine, and we then had to look at how you take it to market. And that's where Mark came in. Mark believed in the project and voted with his checkbook, and not only his own money, also putting together an investor group he led. And that funding has supported us through the initial regulatory process, checking the safety, toxicology of our candidate vaccines, preclinical trials we're conducting at the Galveston National Laboratory in Texas. So what I want to cover today is the situation and challenges the world is facing, our unique approach to try and address that, which is a whole inactivated virus vaccine. And then we'll get on having explained the medicine and the steps we're taking to help the world overcome this pandemic and even potentially an ongoing endemic subsequently, to the business case. Because we are asking people to be motivated to help solve a major global crisis, but we're also trying to position them on the basis where investors who are taking a risk in backing any biotech venture can expect a realistic return, and in fact, an exceptional returns if things go well. So that's today's agenda. Now, I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview on the first few sort of global issues to set the scene before passing over to Philip to explain how we're going to address them. This is a crowded slide, and I'm not expecting anybody to read it. I just want to quickly go through the who, where, why, when, how, and what. So the who I've just explained, our core team plus the wider team of scientists we've drawn on. Where is important. Even though we have an international network across 12 countries, we decided there's a unique advantage in having a US manufactured and developed vaccine. So all the core development and testing work is in the US, leading US research institutions. Philip will tell you more about some of our partners. And this is very significant. And also, of course, doing it in the US regulatory environment under the unprecedented controls and expertise of the FDA. And so this is very significant because there are vaccines being developed in various countries. There are criticisms about transparency of data, about the extent of testing, etc. We won't have a vaccine which goes over and beyond any such doubts or questions by having a US-based, it's a Delaware-based biotech company, as I say. All the research and development is happening here in the United States, and the FDA would be the ultimate regulator. We are looking at manufacturing options in both the US and India. There's a slight cost advantage in India. There may be brand and quality advantages, obviously, in the US. What we need to do, the key theme here is 5 billion people. There's about 7.8 billion people on the planet. North America and Western Europe and Japan, some of the advanced countries, are positioning themselves well. It's taken time, but they're positioning themselves well to move ahead in confronting this crisis. China's got its own approach. But there's another 5 billion people out there who are not currently being covered or catered for at all. And the current estimates could take 3 years to address that. So that is a core theme, as Arthur said on his introduction. The fast follower is one of our themes, because to some extent we're looking at second generation issues, as I say, beyond the first vaccine shot in the US or the UK or Israel, how you actually get something you can deploy worldwide. Our model is based on whole inactivated viral vaccine. This is the most established type of vaccine. They've been around for 50, 60 years. You can go back to Jonas Salk and polio. They've been used on over 30 billion people worldwide. They have the highest safety record. Regulators are familiar with them. There's no new, novel, untested technology involved. Again, Philip will take us through that. So that is the game plan. That is the game plan. US-based, highest quality development, science, research, development, supervision, and then the ability to deploy low cost, safe, easy to administer, no logistical challenges, the kind of vaccine that can be used anywhere in the world. Now, looking at that world out there, if we look at the graph of what's been happening, we've seen this enormous uptick over the last year, coming in 3 waves. The third wave would appear to be declining over the last month or so. None of us know what comes next. Will there be a further uptick in another few months? Will it move from one part of the world to another? We just simply don't know. And obviously there's concerns about new challenges such as the South African virus mutation, which appears to significantly overcome some of the existing vaccine defenses. All current vaccines were based on the D strain, which appeared a year ago. It's hardly been seen in the wild since July, August of 2020. Then at the G strain, we have all these new mutations, and that itself creates a lot of questions in the future. In terms of vaccination programs, we can see what is happening in a number of countries here. And it really goes from a small number of countries, most obviously Israel and the United Arab Emirates, who've been able to give at least a first shot to over half their population already. And you then get a number of countries like the UK and the US, which are now making really good progress. And then it just falls away pretty dramatically. Even the European Union, a few countries have got much beyond about 5%. You'll see France at 4%. And then outside the European Union, Canada's only 3%. China's 2 point something, as is Russia and Brazil. And then you drop to under 1% in very significant populous countries with severe COVID, like Mexico, India, and Indonesia. Most significantly, there's about 130 countries worldwide which have yet to administer a single vaccine dose. So my next slide compares the total vaccines under contract compared with the world population. So in theory, there's been about 1 vaccine shot ordered per person. The reality is entirely different. As you know, the wealthier countries, the US, Canada, Japan, Western Europe, etc., have ordered multiple vaccines per person. Obviously in the expectation that maybe not all of them will be delivered on time, maybe not all of them will ultimately work, etc. They've cornered the market in a certain sense, leaving very weak coverage for most of the world's population. And the net figure who emerge as needing vaccines and not really being currently catered for is about 5 billion people. 5 billion people is 10 billion vaccine shots. And that's just to ensure the primary protection against the pandemic. It's nothing to do with mutations, variations, booster shots, endemics. Simply to protect against the pandemic could take at least 3 years. Some estimates say up to 7 as things currently stand. And that's where we believe we can make quite a significant contribution. So that's the big picture. Let's move forward and start considering how we can address that. Philip, may I hand over to you? And if you would tell us a bit more about your own background, please.
Thank you very much, Brian. And thank you very much to all of the attendees to this webinar. My background just in general is that I studied neurobiology with a Nobel laureate by the name of Torsten Wiesel at Rockefeller University in New York. And then I spent more than a decade at Harvard Medical School, both studying and then researching as well as teaching. After that, I was at Merck Serono, and excuse me, I was at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute for a while, working on an immunological project, which were cancer vaccines, which have now become the rage. This was many years ago. And then I was at Merck Serono for about 5 years, working on multiple sclerosis drugs, and at Endo Pharmaceuticals, working on oncologic agents, and also, again, on immunologically based vaccines for cancer. Most recently, the past decade, I founded a startup company like this one, just with myself and one other person. And about 3 years ago, we took the company in an IPO public on the NASDAQ. Today, that company has about 35 employees worldwide, and we're going into a number of different phase 3 trials. So I want to get into some of the issues and the challenges with regards to fighting COVID-19. So the issues in developing a drug are different and unique for each type of drug that you develop. But for vaccines, they fall into pretty much 3 different buckets. So there's, first of all, in terms of the vaccine itself, there are a number of issues regarding safety. Vaccines are very difficult to test for safety. They're usually only 1 or 2 shots, but it takes many, many years to understand the safety profile of a vaccine. This has led to some of the hesitation with regarding some of the newer technologies, and in particular the mRNA technology, which I'll get to later on. Additionally, the other problem with vaccine is a vaccine, in order to be effective, really has to immunize most of the world's population, or at least the population that it's going to spread to. Right? And in order to do that, you really have to have an easy to store and easy to distribute vaccine efficiently. And that's why the vast, vast majority of global vaccines that have developed to this day do not require a cold chain distribution, meaning that they don't require like -80 like the Pfizer vaccine. And they also have very long shelf lives, and they're easily shipped around the world. The polio vaccine, mumps, rubella, measles, all of those vaccines. And obviously the third issue is cost. If the vaccines are too costly, then they will come back to bite the rest of the world, because if the third world is not able to vaccinate itself, then the virus will continue to mutate in the third world population, and will ultimately come back to the first and second worlds, to the Western world in essence. So going ahead and just saying that you're going to vaccinate the wealthy countries of the world and the Western world is not a solution, because ultimately it will come back to bite you. Additionally, there are regulatory issues. Okay? Getting a vaccine approved, or getting any drug approved, is a major, major hurdle, probably the most complex and difficult hurdle that we have to overcome. In order to do that, you need to have a very clear regulatory pathway. With whole inactivated viral vaccines, because the FDA is so familiar with them, and because historically they have been around and been some of the most effective vaccines, the regulatory pathway is relatively clear, and it's relatively rapid. In fact, for something like the influenza vaccine, there's a new vaccine approved each and every year. It's a different vaccine, but because the regulators understand that process very, very well, they're capable of doing that. And therefore, we believe with the whole inactivated viral vaccine, especially since there's already been experience with the vaccines, the whole inactivated viral vaccines that have been developed in China and in other places, we believe that our regulatory pathway will be much simpler and easier to overcome than some of the other newer technologies. Additionally, there's major challenges in ensuring that the vaccine that you produce is of high quality and always consistent. And that is the primary reason in many ways why we go for an FDA and EMA approval, European Medicines Agency. The FDA and EMA approval ensure that your vaccine is of the highest quality and consistently manufactured. And this is why it's very interesting that in China, there's a vast, vast market for Western vaccines, because many of the Chinese middle class and upper class are unwilling to take Chinese products. The final and perhaps most challenging issue with a vaccine development program is the issues with the virus itself. As people have been watching the news recently, it's quite clear that there are many mutations, changes in the virus's genetic makeup, which ultimately cause changes in the virus's ability to infect other people, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. These have spread around the world so that you have different variants or different strains of the virus, whether it be in South Africa or Brazil or the UK. And adapting to these changes is highly complex and very difficult. And it's very difficult to anticipate what will be the changes that you can make in your vaccine that will overcome the changes that the virus is constantly making on itself in order to adapt and to protect itself in the environment. So I'll get more into this in the next slide, but one of the main advantages of a whole inactivated viral vaccine is that in contrast to virtually 90% of the vaccines that are being utilized and made today, those vaccines primarily focus on what's called the spike or the spike protein, which is approximately 20% of the virus. So they're looking at a little piece. It's as if you were going ahead and trying to identify a soldier of a foreign army. And you say, you know what? All the soldiers in the foreign army wear red helmets, okay? So we're going to teach everyone to identify a red helmet, and as soon as you see a red helmet, shoot, all right? And destroy that soldier. Now, the only problem is that if they switch helmets, if they switch to yellow helmets, you're in deep trouble. But let's say you teach the Army to try to identify everything, the uniform of the Army, the guns that they carry, their belt buckles, whatever it may be. They may switch out the red helmet for a yellow helmet, but the vaccine will still teach people how to identify other things that may change. And the probability that all of those things, whether it be the uniform, or in this case, the spike protein, or the nucleocapsid protein, or other components of the virus will change all of them and still be an effective virus is very, very unlikely. And therefore, a whole inactivated virus, as we see with the polio vaccine and other vaccines, is actually quite adaptable, even as the vaccine mutates. Next slide, please.
Philip, you were asked a question.
I see a lot of questions on the screen. It's hard for me to read through all of them.
So, Philip, if I may ask you one or two, because they really relate to your last slide. And how capable do you think? We've seen research only yesterday, actually coming out of a paper on research done at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, where we're doing our own preclinical studies, which found that the Pfizer vaccine, when confronted with the South African variant, is 2/3 less effective in the amount of antibodies. And I believe there was also, I saw a report that Moderna was 5/6 less effective in terms of antibody production against that virus. Could you just expand a little on why the whole virus, being 5 times greater in size than the spike, would be able, we believe, and some research shows it already, to defend better against these emerging mutations?
Sure. I think the key point is that the vaccines that have been developed, whether it be by Moderna, by Pfizer, by AstraZeneca, they have only focused on the operational part of the virus, which is a relatively small part. It's about 20% of the virus, even smaller than that in actuality. And the reason that they focused, and that's the spike area, which includes the receptor, what's called the receptor binding domain, and you may have heard in the media, the RBD region. And the reason that's so important is because that's actually the area of the virus that allows it to enter the cell, enter the cells of the body. And if you mutate that, the thought is that if you mutate it too much, then it won't be able to enter the cells. Unfortunately, that presumption was incorrect because the mutations in that region, in that area, have led to other mutations that are more difficult for the immune system to recognize because they've been trained to recognize a particular sequence, so to speak, the red helmet. And now that helmet is going from red, it went to orange. It's not quite yellow yet. So therefore, there's a little bit of recognition of that piece, of that mutation, but it's definitely reduced significantly. In the whole inactivated virus, yes, you go in there with one form of that spike protein on your virus because you're using a particular variant of the virus. The advantage is, though, is that there are many other parts of the virus that have not mutated that the body can still recognize because they've seen it before. And although they're not critical to the virus's function in the same way that the RBD or the spike protein is critical, they still allow the immune system to impart a certain level of protection and immunity to the body by going ahead and attaching to it and also creating a much longer term adaptable response by the immune system.
I just wanted to pick up another great question that came in before you move on, which asks, if a WIV, a whole inactivated virus, is such a good approach, why are we not seeing it in the United States? It wasn't part of Warp Speed. So I just want to give a very short answer to that. Half the world's population lives in just 7 countries: China, India, USA, Indonesia, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Brazil. 4 billion people. 6 of those 7 countries, representing 3.7 billion people, have already approved whole inactivated virus vaccines. So the US is actually an anomaly. The rest of the world, not the rest of the world in its entirety, but as I say, 6 of the 7 most populous countries have already approved WIV vaccines. There aren't enough of them being made or anything like that, but they've approved them and started using them. Why the US hasn't goes more to the structure possibly of the pharma industry in the West and its reliance on trying to develop new IP, from a commercial perspective. And we don't really want to go there. We just want to say there's an interesting gap. We're sure the FDA would be happy to consider a WIV vaccine. We're the first people in the US to put this forward. So sorry to interrupt, Philip, but I thought it was a great question that had come in there and kind of follows on naturally from what you were saying.
No, I appreciate it. Right. And additionally, there's not only, I mean, and this is, I'm not trying to detract in any way from Pfizer or Moderna and from Warp Speed in essence, because I think without Warp Speed, actually, we would be in a totally different situation today. It amazingly accelerated the approval process, not only for those vaccines, but for other vaccines that are being developed. And that's totally to the credit of Warp Speed. But it also is a highly motivating factor that people were looking for a technology that is rapidly adaptable to new threats that may come out. And therefore, when Moderna and Pfizer, or I shouldn't say it's actually BioNTech from Germany, were developing these mRNA technologies, they were looking at going ahead and trying this also for many, many other vaccines that they had been trying to develop over the past many years, none of which, by the way, were approved, very interestingly. So in order to recoup that investment, they have to charge a lot of money because they've invested many years of research. And the business model is very different. The business model, and it's IP protected. There isn't a good business model for a Western pharmaceutical company, that without IP protection, that would allow them to make the profit margins necessary to recover all of the costs that are necessary for the development of that type of vaccine. And that's why pretty much in the West, no one has pursued a WIV vaccine. So if you go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly go over this. These are, we've mentioned a few of the different types of vaccines that are out there. Ours is a whole inactivated virus vaccine. All right, and Cinevac and Sinopharm, which are 2 large Chinese companies, have developed their own whole inactivated viral vaccine. Now, one might think, oh, that's a terrible disadvantage. In essence, we've turned it into an advantage. Because of that, there's a significant chance that it will ease our regulatory pathway, because now, not only is there data from their studies, from their animal studies, their phase 1 and phase 3 studies, but they also have wide distribution and utilization of these vaccines in many countries of the world, including countries that are freer and more open to reveal the data from those studies and from their populations, like Turkey, like the UAE, like Brazil, et cetera. And therefore, you see a lot of variations in the data as well. Nonetheless, they've proven themselves to be relatively safe and very, very effective vaccines. And because of that, because we're using a similar model, we believe that the FDA will look favorably on our data, which we believe will be much more controlled and with much better quality and monitoring in place. There's also a new entry to this. This is Bharat Biotech, which amazingly got their vaccine approved for emergency use in India, but that was probably politically motivated, but also of a very similar design. But the Indian regulators were confident that it would work because of the tried and tested capabilities of a whole inactivated virus. And then there is one other Western player, Valneva. The other vaccine technologies use very, very different types of technology from the whole inactivated virus, which is on a simplistic level, very easy to understand. And a lot of people are very familiar with Salk and Sabin vaccines that were developed for polio. The viral-based vector vaccine. I'm sorry?
May I interrupt one?
Sure.
So I suspect that others are thinking the same thing I am. To the extent that you may know, have the companies that are listed with Rafana there in the whole inactivated virus program that is being used, do you have a sense of whether, or do you have any data to support that it has worked?
Yes, Arthur, the two Chinese ones, Cinevac and Sinopharm, already obtained emergency use authorization in July, so about 6 months ahead of Pfizer. And there's now been tens of millions of doses administered across about 25 countries, with apparently very good results to date. And the Bharat Biotech, as Philip just mentioned, just got approval in India at the end of its stage 2, and has been given to about 13 million people to date. So, these are not like stage 3 trials going to 30,000 people. We're looking at data now from maybe collectively 50 million people. The regulators approved all 3 at the end of stage 2. You might say that's very strange, but as Philip explained, because of the long history of safety of WIV, it's not like taking a Moderna or Pfizer, never used before in humans. And now, in fact, the 2 Chinese ones have received final permanent authorization in China in recent weeks, after Cinevac, for instance, finished safety tests, which were academically peer-reviewed in the West, on old people, because initially it wasn't used on certain categories. So we've a tremendous amount of data already, and more emerging to support our case, based on the actual, 40, 50 million doses collectively already given of these vaccines.
So the data.
And additionally, I'll just add to that I think the data that's probably the most critical, because you'd never know when you're going out into 50 million people, how many of the observations are going to be made or associated with the utilization of the vaccine. But they also have published their phase 3, phase 1, and phase 2 data in the most prestigious peer-reviewed journals, and they've been criticized and torn apart by these peer-reviewed journals like Nature, Science, Cell, The Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, and all of them have found that the data that they've reported is really actually quite consistent and quite good.
That's what I was looking for.
Okay. I figured as a scientist, I figured you were looking for that. You weren't looking to figure out that 50 million people have gotten it. But
yeah, Mark and I have a similarity. We want results.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. You want results. So those are controlled trials with controlled results. And interestingly, I should say that their clinical trials weren't just performed in China. They were performed in countries where they did not, unlike China, which I have political disputes with, but for various reasons, there are countries which did not have any fear of reporting the data as is. So the consistency and the dependability of the data are quite good. The next type of, I'll just very briefly, because we're running low on time, a viral vector vaccine. This is like the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson vaccine. This is a very interesting concept. Imagine that you take something like a cold virus, which exceptionally rarely kills somebody, right? And it's quite safe, and everyone has seen it before. And you go ahead and insert in that cold virus, in this case, cold adenovirus, and you insert a piece of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, or a piece of COVID-19. Now what happens is that virus goes in and infects cells in your body, just like it would if it were giving you the common cold, but it's also producing a piece of the COVID-19 virus. And the immune system learns to recognize that little piece as well as the rest of the virus. The problem with this approach is, although it's a very elegant approach, and for instance, some people use cold viruses from animals, which humans have not seen before. Nonetheless, because many people have seen these viruses before, the immune system already recognizes it and frequently doesn't give the immune system adequate time to recognize the little bit of change in it, because it's going to clear the virus and destroy it because it's already seen it before and it's reacting more quickly. And especially if you come back with a booster, it almost never works well as a booster, because then the virus has already been seen and the immune system is already primed to recognize this cold virus and to eliminate it before it can go ahead and recognize the particular little piece that you're interested in teaching the immune system to recognize. In principle, vaccines are there to teach the immune system how to identify a foreign invader. In this case, it's a virus. It could be a bacteria. And the reason is because if you can identify them quickly, then you can win in the race. I know Mark loves race car driving, and he's always focused on races. And with the immune system, it's always a race against the pathogen. It's always a race against the bacteria, against the virus. Who is going to destroy who more quickly? All right. So if you have the advantage and you can identify them right from the start, then you can win the battle. And the vaccine goes in and teaches the immune system to identify it quickly so that you can destroy the invader as quickly as possible before it overcomes all of your defenses. The third and fourth types of vaccines are protein-based and nucleic acid-based. The protein-based are very, very easy in concept, and in many ways are similar to the whole virus-based viruses in the sense that they're taking the whole thing, a piece of protein, but in this case, they're just taking a tiny piece of the whole virus. While we take the whole virus itself, so there are many different things that the immune system can recognize, the protein-based subunit virus only takes a little tiny piece, the spike protein or something else. And the problem is that if that piece changes, then the vaccine barely works at all, especially since a protein-based vaccine is not being processed by the cell in the same way that, let's say, a nucleic acid vaccine would be processed. The nucleic acid vaccines are the newest technology. They have a tremendous amount of potential, and I'm very excited about them as well. But there is one thing that is very worrisome to me and very unknown, and that is that they have no history. And so we really don't know how these vaccines will affect people in the long term. Additionally, on a practical level, obviously, they're not that useful for dealing with the third world because of cost and because of distribution constraints. But these viruses just take a piece of the genetic material of the mRNA in the case of the COVID-19 virus, and they actually insert it into any cell in the body. And that's a very, very unusual concept. So every cell in the body, not just those cells that can get SARS-CoV-2 infections, not just the cells in your lung, etc., but your brain cells, your heart cells, your toe cells, whatever cell exists in the body, if this vaccine comes in contact with it, the mRNA is inserted into that cell, and that cell's machinery are taken over to produce that piece of the vaccine, of the virus, excuse me. And that's how the immune system learns to do this. Now, this is very short-lived, and people shouldn't worry about genetic engineering in that sense. But nonetheless, it is going into a large number of cells which we don't understand how they may operate in the future. Next slide. So where are we at right now? Right now, we're in the midst of our preclinical studies. We're using the hamster model, which is currently the best model because hamsters actually get sick from COVID-19. When you look at, people usually say, why don't you go to monkeys? Monkeys don't get sick from COVID-19, fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it. Mice, rats, they don't get sick from COVID-19. None of these animals do. And therefore, whenever you're testing a vaccine in an animal model, you want an animal model that actually gets sick, and you can see what the effects are of your vaccine in protecting them against an infection. So the hamster has been found to be the best model. We're doing that at the University of Texas at the Galveston National Laboratory. This is only one of 2 laboratories in the whole United States that is what's called a BSL-4, a biosafety level 4 laboratory. This is critical. This is where they work on all the experimental stuff. So I don't know if anyone's old enough to remember the Andromeda strain. But if something comes in strange from outer space, or if you have a new pathogen that comes out of China and it's very deadly, or Ebola virus, these are the only two places where you can study them because they're very, very well controlled and very well sealed off. They're not worried about that pathogen escaping into the environment. And the reason we chose Professor Tsang is because Professor Tsang did extensive work on SARS-CoV-1, which is far more fatal than SARS-CoV-2. And he actually identified an unusual observation that in SARS-CoV-1, frequently the vaccine itself can cause an immune enhancement and can make the disease worse, right? Fortunately, in SARS-CoV-2, that is not the case. But nonetheless, we really wanted to assuage the worries of many of the scientists and regulators out there, showing that our whole inactivated viral vaccine does not induce that type of response. The Cedar Cross Research Center in Chicago, these are both US-based scientists who've been in the US for many, many decades. The Cedar Cross Center was chosen because of, first of all, Dr. Sugimoto's incredible expertise in running clinical trials. You can see that he's run hundreds of clinical trials for all of the major players in the United States and around the world in many different disease populations. But what makes Dr. Sugimoto's Clinical Research Center particularly interesting and particularly special for us is the fact that it has a very large minority population which are differentially affected adversely by COVID-19. And because of that, we can start to address and look at what are some of the differences in the people who are more affected by COVID-19 as opposed to those who are less affected by COVID-19. And so we're very excited to be doing both our phase 1 and our phase 2 research with Dr. Sugimoto. In addition to that, what's not shown here is we're working with one of the premier regulatory advisors, who is a very large organization who has done more 505(b)(2) applications and more UAE, or emergency use authorization applications, than almost any other regulatory advisor in the United States. And they are helping us in our IND, or our investigational new drug application, and our pre-IND applications. And we're putting together, as we speak, we actually have a meeting with them tomorrow morning. And with that, I'll turn it back over. I see there's a bunch of questions. So maybe I'll take a few questions and then I'll turn it back over to.
Yeah, Philip, I think a couple of them follow directly from what you've been saying. And so, for instance, on the second shot of the Pfizer vaccines, there's been reports of a pretty high level of, adverse, uncomfortable effects. That's not been seen, I should add, in the WIV, where the people given the placebo and given the real injection report the same discomfort from the injection and don't report much serious problems. The Pfizer one has been associated with possibly, I've got to put this very carefully, there's a case from Nebraska this week reported where either Pfizer or Moderna has been attributed as the cause of death of a person in the 40s who had significant comorbidities. Now, the CDC is tracking this issue. There's been 1,190 deaths within a short time of getting the Pfizer vaccine or Moderna, mostly the Pfizer vaccine in the US to date. And it's been seen in other countries, 77 in Norway, cases 15 in Holland, etc. Nobody's saying the Pfizer vaccine is causing these deaths. What's happening, it seems, is people with significant comorbidities, older people, other conditions, they do get a bad reaction to this type, the mRNA vaccine, especially in the second shot. And that bad reaction, a fever or something, is enough to trigger other problems they have. So as I say, we're not saying those vaccines are killing people. That's a terrible thing. But there is, as I say, 1,190 cases reported so far in the US of this. Philip, can you explain why there's such a strong reaction, especially to the second shot of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines?
Yeah. So the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are unique in the sense that they're taking over the cell's machinery. Essentially, it's like a factory, production factory. And so it's a little bit complex to go into the immunological explanation, but essentially what they're doing is they're teaching the immune system relatively rapidly the context in which to recognize the virus by producing this one piece of the virus, in this case the spike protein, and presenting it or placing it on the surface of all of these cells around the body. So what happens is that the second time around, when cells start producing it, the body really gets very, very worried that this is, in essence, a real invasion because of the diversity of the different cell populations that are seeing this. Cell populations which may have other cells which are involved in immune regulation and other things like that. And because of that, although in general, with any vaccine, like the flu vaccine, you'll get flu-like symptoms and so on and so forth, and it can actually induce that, and that's all being induced by the immune response. That's the immune system, not the virus, not the vaccine, but it's the immune system's response to the vaccine, its immunological response. So in those vaccines, the second shot often will induce a very, very strong secondary reaction, which is less so the case because of the nature of how whole inactivated viral vaccines work, and that they're not taking over the cell's machinery. I saw a question here that I thought was a really good question, and that I wanted to address, which is, and that was from the same person, the J&J shot. I think the J&J shot will be available in a second dose. It's from Peter Thurlow. It will be available in a second dose, in a one-dose form. But I think that it's really not going to be much different than other vaccines in the sense of its efficacy after one dose will be similar to their efficacy after one dose. I think Brian can address this.
Yeah, I'd like to give a commercial perspective on this. I personally, from a business, wearing a business hat, I think Johnson & Johnson are doing a great job. Because the problem of the adenovirus model, the viral vector model, as Philip explained, is you can trick the body once. Well, maybe the first time you can't trick it if it's seen that particular common cold, adenovirus, whatever it is before. Now, to sidestep, AstraZeneca used a virus from a chimpanzee. So obviously humans not seen a zoological virus like that before. It works the first time. The problem is that it's already seen it when you give the booster shot, and so they're not getting so much effectiveness from the booster shot. And my business assumption is Johnson & Johnson looked at the data and they said, in our case, with the adenovirus vaccine, we're not going to add a lot from giving 2 shots over 1 shot. Therefore, let's go to market with 1 shot, which is massively effective, not having to go back a second time. Now, if you look at the efficacy, it would appear that the vaccine type with the lowest efficacy, and I'm just reporting on the data to date, is this category of vaccines. The efficacy is not particularly high. It's 20–30% lower than the Modernas and so on. And particularly AstraZeneca's run into some issues. So in Europe, for instance, 7 major countries, including Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and Poland, have all decided not to use AstraZeneca for people over a certain age. They didn't see it as being effective. Switzerland, the Swiss regulators have not authorized AstraZeneca at all. They don't believe it's sufficiently effective. They want to see new data from an upcoming stage 3 trial in the States. And in South Africa, when they ran out the AstraZeneca vaccine on stage 3 trial, it failed to hit the 50% point. It came into 49%, and they've pulled the program. They'd started vaccinating with it, and they've stopped in South Africa. So AstraZeneca's hit this issue that it's the least effective vaccine type. Johnson & Johnson's in the same bucket, but I think what they've done is really clever. They're simply saying, we can get to 60-something% in 1 shot. We're not going to get way ahead of that with 2 shots. Let's call it a 1-shot vaccine, get more of it out there faster, and help a lot of people. So that's my interpretation, and I think the Johnson & Johnson is a very strategically sensible approach. And so I believe the 1 shot will be approved by the FDA on the 26th of February. It's coming up in the next week or 2, and I'm pretty sure they're going to approve it because there aren't enough vaccines. We've ignored one question we'll come back to later about if there's enough vaccines in effect. There are not enough vaccines. People are scrambling. And Johnson & Johnson has a good story by general standards. It's more effective than a flu vaccine on 1 shot. Why not take it?
So related to that, there's a question about whether your vaccine will be a single dose vaccine.
Right. So, Philip, do you want to take that
one? Sure. No, theoretically, it could be a single dose vaccine. It all depends on, I sincerely believe that would be the best strategy from a pandemic point of view, would be to give the single dose and to impart as much protection on as many people as possible, even though it's only partial protection. It's more of a strategic question. The efficacy does not drop in contrast to the adenovirus vaccines with the second dose. So the second dose will definitely give you greater efficacy, as it does in the polio vaccine. But you do get very good efficacy with a single dose of a whole inactivated viral vaccine. So I think that what ultimately happens when you distribute to large populations around the world is that, in essence, in practical terms, it often becomes a single dose vaccine because you reach the single dose for everyone, and then only 50 or 60% of the population comes back for the second dose for a million different reasons, and therefore it acts as that. Its efficacy as a single dose is probably going to be in the 60 to 70% range, which is just as good as J&J or anyone else.
Philip, can you just elaborate on what we're doing in Texas at the Galveston National Lab in terms of protocols, please?
Sure. So in the Galveston National Laboratory, what you do is you go ahead and you vaccinate the animals. You vaccinate them. We're testing out both what the efficacy will be after a single dose and after 2 doses, which would be the normal protocol that most people are using. That's separated by a number of weeks. Hamsters are not humans, so their immune systems react somewhat differently. Okay, and then after they've been vaccinated, whether it be once or twice, with twice being with a booster, then you go ahead and you challenge them with live virus, and that's why it can only be done in a BSL-3 facility, in a facility like this that's very big. And when you do that, you don't challenge them like you and I would be challenged on the street typically. You and I may be challenged by 1,000, maximum maybe 5,000 viral particles. That's a very, very small amount for a virus. Sometimes even by just 10 or 20 viral particles, right? We're challenging these hamsters with 1 million viral particles, or many, many orders of magnitude. So every single hamster, if they don't have a vaccine, will get quite sick. And then you look at the level of protection that it imparts on the hamsters, whether they lose weight, whether they're very sick looking, etc. In addition to that, you also look at the antibodies that these hamsters develop over time. So you look at it in the very beginning, in the middle, and in the end to see how many antibodies they're developing to the vaccine itself before they're challenged, and how many of those are capable of stopping an infection.
So the key point there is that we're actually testing for both single and double doses at the end of the day.
Correct. So Philip and Mark, I'm just conscious of time and we want to move on to Mark's session. I see a question from Danny Kitzberg. I just want to explain, we're using what's known as the BPL inactivation approach, and that's now accepted as being extremely effective. It's been used by all the other vaccines we've mentioned. It's not what was used 10 or 20 years ago when formaldehyde was used instead of BPL. So without getting technical, but we are using an approach which is very well accepted now as completely killing the virus that's used to create the vaccine. Mark, I'm going to try and segue to you because
Sure.
we're running towards the clock.
Sure.
And there again is just the summary of our strategy: safe, effective vaccine for worldwide distribution. Let's roll the slides forward.
Yep.
And the markets. This kind of touches on a question we haven't answered. Given that the Chinese and the Indians are trying to export vaccines, will there be enough marketplace left for Rafana? We estimate there's 5 billion people underserved, 10 billion vaccine shots potentially, and that's just to curtail the pandemic. The current confirmed capacity of the 4 other producers of WIV, 2 in China, 1 in India, and 1 in the UK, Scotland, is about 1 billion. Now they're all trying to increase that capacity. Maybe they get to 2 billion. There's 11 billion shots, 10 billion shots to be met. So we think there's going to be, unfortunately, lots of market, and that's just in curtailing the pandemic. Then, of course, there's the market for mutations. Who knows what size that could be with these new variants, and the endemic kind of issue like the flu of ongoing booster shots. So next slide, please, so I can bridge to Mark. Mark, why invest in Refana? You voted with your checkbook some months ago. Why? Why did you take the brave step?
Well, thanks, Brian and Philip. Thank you guys for all the good work you're doing. And also thanks to Arthur. Thanks to Natasha as well. She's a good friend, and more than that. Also to my buddy, Jared Lawless, who actually introduced me to these guys. Why did I invest in Rafana? I'm a Canadian double-degreed engineer, got a business degree at that school in Boston, had been working in a lot of different worlds for most of my career was basically investing in businesses and having a good life. And all of a sudden I got a call from these guys saying, hey, we've got a really great idea. And I've been leading in and understanding all of the things we've all been reading about the pandemic and the virus and all this stuff. And I really didn't know much about this, but they told me the story of what they were doing. It sort of made logical sense to me as a problem solving kind of guy. So I thought about this from two perspectives. One is kind of the hard or professional perspective, and that's really what everyone on this call is thinking about. What's the reward for investing in something like a company like Refana? And also from a more personal and softer side perspective. So let me just spend a bit of time to elaborate on both of these. The first one on the harder sort of financial side, why is this a good idea? Well, I looked at it and we've looked at it from both an outside and an inside perspective. On the outside perspective, if we look at 7 of the companies that are out there investing their time and energy in this particular problem, trying to build solutions and vaccines for this pandemic, there are 7 companies that we categorized here, and we looked at the opportunity that they took and the growth that they had in their valuations over the last 12 months or less in a couple cases. And you can see that some of the names you can recognize: Moderna, BioNTech, Cinevac, the company we talked about from China, et cetera, Novavax. These guys have all done extremely well in the last 12 months in terms of their valuations. So from a comparables perspective, it looks like all of them, in particular the ones that are in the orange bars that are actually WIV related players, have all done very well. So that's a signal to me that if we do well with the development of our solution and get it out to the market, we can do well. On an internal perspective side, we also did some modeling, and we didn't summarize the detail here at a detailed level, just at a very high level. Looking at the market, this 5 billion plus number of people out there that don't have access to a vaccine, not enough vaccines available, not enough players with enough solutions. If we were to get involved, and depending on whether we get to be a 50 million dose a year or a billion dose a year player, we looked at different demand scenarios. And we looked at the cost structure of manufacturing in India and or the United States. Looks like we could do this in such a way that even with a, say, $4 to $5 per dose revenue value, we can generate a decent amount of pre-tax net income to make this company worth a lot of money. So from a financial perspective, those who are on the call who are interested in investing, this is a pretty good story. That's an important part, but here's a more important part from a personal perspective. So there's a noble purpose here, and the noble purpose is take a step back and look at the fact that there's been over 110 million cases of COVID-19 infections in the world in the last 12 or so months. 2.5 million deaths so far with this pandemic. When you do the math, it gets pretty shocking when you realize that that represents 2 9/11 fatality rates in a day, times 375 days, because it's more than a year now since the pandemic was formally declared. So there's clearly a reason for all of us to get involved in thinking about how do we solve one of the biggest crises and problems that we've all faced in our whole life. In my particular case, I can announce a good news part of the story, and that is that about 10 hours ago, my very first granddaughter, Milla Rain Schmidt, was born here in Chicago. She's now 10 hours old, and she's one of, I did the calculations, 140 million people that have been born in the last 12 months or so in the world who have been born into this pandemic and will live with the outcomes of it for the rest of their lives. So the question is, what can we do to try and solve the problem? So one of the reasons I also decided to invest is I said, you know what, there's a noble purpose here to go after solving a huge problem in the world, and anything that I can do to have impact with these gentlemen and with the rest of the team will be really amazing to me. And that's another reason I invested. The last point that I would make is that these guys, you know, being based in Israel, they named their company Rafana. It's a Hebrew name, and it actually refers to, in terms of translation, please heal. I thought that was a really interesting way to think about how to name a company that's working on what we're trying to work on. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Brian to kind of talk about a few themes, and also to wrap up with what we're asking folks from the Family Office Insights community for.
Thank you, Mark, and congratulations on your granddaughter. I'm going to skip this slide. It's just a summary of what we've discussed, and except for the one theme that it said at the bottom that no one is safe until everyone is safe.
Yep.
And that's why we got to get this thing out worldwide. Now, here's the deal. There's a question about timing. We need to get through stage 1 and stage 2. That's about a 6-month process. And at that stage, at the end of a stage 2, you're in a position where you've proven that your drug basically is safe, that it works to a reasonable degree, and that it's the same as other drugs. Very important in our case, the Indians and Chinese, and possibly the British one will be out by then as well, which are, you know, safe and effective in tens of millions of people. So at that point, you know, you may already be in a position, this is 6 to 9 months out, of being able to take some money off the table on investment terms, because it's quite probable that there would be an opportunity to partner with a global pharma company. Of the top 20 global pharma companies, only half a dozen have vaccine candidates. Most of them got them from little players, AstraZeneca from Oxford University, Pfizer from BioNTech. And some of the big companies who went alone, like Merck and GSK Sanofi, their initial projects failed. So if we get if we get the only FDA approved working WIV vaccine at that stage, we already may hit a significant point in financial terms from an investment consideration of joint ventures, licensing, selling out, doing an IPO, who knows. So that's the kind of time frame. We need money to fund through that next 6 to 9 month period. The current funding put in by the group led by Mark has taken forward the vaccine design through now the preclinical trials and the initial regulatory work. The next funding needs $10 million end to end. And this is all based on contracts and so on in place, or proposals in place with all the key players. Because people ask us, how come these numbers are so small? So I'm going to segue for a moment to Cinevac. Cinevac was entering its stage 1 trials in April, and they created a special purpose vehicle. They couldn't use their main company. Their main company was in a mess for various reasons. It's a longer story. They created a special purpose vehicle just to the vaccine. So it was really like a startup, but with some expertise obviously provided. And at that stage, they raised $15 million. So where you're seeing 10 there, they raised 15. And with that 15, they got it through those next stages. And they raised that 15 million at a pre-money of 85 million or a post-money of 100 million last March. And then by the time they got to stage 3, they sold another 15 million of, 15% of the company, this time for over $500 million, 515 million, giving a valuation of 3.4 billion. So Cinevac from the stage we were at was given a valuation of 100 million. We're not being greedy. We're looking at a valuation of pre-money of 22 million. So significantly less than Cinevac at the same stage. 8 months later, they were up 34x. If you put in $100,000, it was 3.4 million in 8 months. So, you know, we can't foretell the future. Old biotech is risky, and, you know, we need to give all the normal investor warnings. But we're looking at this in 2 stages, because by the time we spent the 2.5 million on stage 1, we then will show that it's safe in humans. And safe enough to go to an expanded trial. The only difference between stage 1 and stage 2 is you consciously start with a smaller number of 50 or 60 healthy younger people to show that there's no, you know, safety issues in humans that didn't appear in animals. And then you get permission to roll it into stage 2, 400 or 500 people. And the only difference in the cost of those 2 trials, both in Chicago with Cedar Cross and Dr. Danny Sugimoto, is the number of people. You know, we have some overhead, we have some regulatory cost, etc. But basically, the more people you put in a trial, it costs more money to do the injections and monitoring, etc. So we need 2.5 million for stage 1, and we'll follow that quickly with the 7.5 million for stage 2. And for this next round, we've proposed a pre-money value of $22 million. I say it's a 78% or 70% discount or so on the Cinevac valuation at the same stage. So we're trying to make it, you know, attractive. We're trying to share both the risks and the upside with our backers. And that is the proposal, which we would ask anybody who feels it's the right thing for them to consider. I just summarized what Mark said. It's both a noble cause and potentially an opportunity to earn a very handsome, very significant return while investing in a noble cause in something that's relatively de-risked. There's always risk in biotech, so I'm just going to emphasize that again. But to the extent we're following a proven path and following the vaccines that have been, you know, approved now in other countries, and we're working with leading scientists and research institutes here in the United States, we have confidence as high as you can that this is going to get through that in that next 6 to 9 month period. So that's the summary of the deal, so to speak. Arthur, may I hand back over to you?
Yeah, please. Thank you. That was, let me put it to you this way. The intention of this webinar is to present you the opportunity and this ask. And aside from that, it was a really interesting discussion and presentation about what's really going on with COVID without the political friction.
Absolutely.
Can I say that? So for me, it was a tremendous learning exercise. Sans the intent, which is truly to engage the community to see if this is an opportunity for them. And in addition to what Brian just said, I would suggest to the audience that if there was a whether it's for you or not, you obviously know what to do if it's for you. However, if you wouldn't mind sharing it with folks that that we don't, that might benefit from knowing about it. And that would be not only a good idea for the noble cause and potential financial return, but appreciated by me and the community and our friends here. So we have kept the attention, and thank you all for staying beyond the time. And if I can ask for one of you to sort of wrap it up, and then we'll close things
Arthur,
out.
I'd like to say something. And first of all, there are other members of the team who are not on the call, and without them, this would not have been possible. So I'd really love to give an incredible thanks to both Debbie Fuller and Aviat Kitzberg, who work behind the scenes diligently to help make this whole program happen, whether it be finding rare reagents or whether it be designing our slide deck and following all of the news that's around the world. They really are an incredible contributor to the whole team. Thank you.
Super cool. As a matter of record now.
Okay.
So there you go. Who would like to wrap it up?
Okay, well, I just want to thank Arthur, you and your colleagues. You've put us here. Really want to thank the audience for giving this time and opportunity. And again, I want to thank Mark for the courage and leadership he showed in putting together and leading the first round for us, and in being here with us today to endorse what we're doing to potentially the next generation of investors. So thank you all very much.
Arthur, I'll just make one last comment, and that is, this is a message to COVID. Rafana, the Family Office Insights community, and all the friends and family that we have involved, we're coming after you, and we're not going to finish until we get there. So let's try and work hard to get this to happen. Thank you all for attending.
Relentless pursuit. Thank you very much. To all the attendees and to our presenters here today, I would like to just say again, as I usually do, thank you for spending the only thing you can't make more of, and that's your time. Super appreciate it. Until next time, thank you very much. Great job, guys.
Cheers.
See you. Bye-bye.